Welcome to Catholic Answers Live. My name is Edgar Lujano. Welcome to this Christmas Eve special episode of the show where we're here with Father Andrew Dalton. We're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin. It's something that I think every Catholic should know about, and also be prepared to explain what this shroud is and what it actually means to people of the Catholic faith. So, Father Andrew Dalton, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I love Catholic Answers, and I'm so honored to finally be here. I've probably seen this on my screen 1,000 times.
Well, now you're a part of the screen. This is great. So, the Shroud of Turin. I remember hearing about this thing growing up when I started getting involved in the Catholic faith, and it's always been up in the air of how people explain it. You either have people that are from the secular world who just immediately say, that's not real, it's been debunked. Why do Catholics still look at this thing and claim it's Jesus? And then you have from the religious perspective, the grandmothers at church who have a deep devotion to it. So before we get into that, tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got into studying the Shroud.
Right. Well, I had a similar experience, I think, where I didn't take account of how important this is and how potentially powerful it is for evangelization. Because I was 10 years a seminarian, and I was not well versed on the Shroud. If I even knew of its existence, I think barely I did, but I couldn't have told you 2 sentences about it. And so there I am in Rome studying theology, and a priest friend of mine said, there's a Shroud expert coming. You need to hear this. You need to hear this lecture. And that is Emanuela Marinelli, and she is amazing. So if you don't know her work, I mean, she's Italian, but her works are published in English as well. I sat at the back of the room just in case I had to, sneak out early, because I didn't know how monumentally important it would be and how life-changing it would be now. But I remember being so compelled by her fast-talking but well-researched and really, really well-argued presentation of the Shroud and how it points to the person of Jesus, the passion of Jesus. I left there thinking, how is it possible that after 10 years I've not been told this? And so I really lost sleep that night thinking about all the potential of it. And I was really just there because we had a Shroud exhibit in Rome, and I was the English speaker who was assigned to guide others through this exhibit. So I ought to know a thing or two, right? I felt embarrassed about my own ignorance. And so, gosh, I better get some education here.
The tour guide needs to be educated on the Shroud.
Right? And so there I am playing catch up, and I'm just blown away by her expertise. She says, come back next week to meet a physicist. And in a short time, I met Paolo Di Lazzaro, who unpacked much more about the light effects, and as they're recorded on the Shroud, we can perhaps go more into that. But he said, if you come back next week, you'll meet Barry Schwartz. And Barry was the technical photographer at STURP, and that's the Shroud of Turin research project of 1978. And so in the course of 3 weeks, I had met 3 of these top-tier experts on the Shroud, and all of a sudden, I was positioned to learn more, because there was at a pontifical university in Rome, a year-long program to learn from the most renowned Shroud scholars and leave with a panoramic view of what is often seen as a very niche area. And this is where I think your question was coming from. It's like you would have to be so expert in just one thing, like the botany of the Shroud, the pollen of the Shroud, the blood of the Shroud. What about the image formation on the Shroud? Each of those is a different sector of science. It's a different sector of study, if it's historical study, archaeological study, not to mention biblical theology or magisterial statements, right? And so here I was at a pontifical university in its first year, in which it was offering a year-long program with each of the sectors represented by the world's greatest experts. And I was like, what a privilege that I just stumbled into this. And here it is become something really important for my ministry. I travel around the world teaching about the Shroud, but I wish, to be honest, many more priests, many more educators, many of your audience will be in a position to share the faith. These are the ones that need to know that this is perhaps the most powerful tool of evangelization that we have in our hands, and it's been underplayed because we've not been knowledgeable about it. And it's not our fault. It just wasn't accessible. in ways that were within reach. It wasn't easy to find it. Now, much more.
Yeah.
And so it's not just at school, it's not just with books, but now it's with museums that are going all. I'm so excited that right around the block here in Southern California is a brand new museum, but that's trying to bring to the masses awareness of this greatest relic in all of Christendom.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it. I think it's important for us to, being, of course, an apologetics organization, is going through the arguments of the authenticity of the shroud and just debunking them. And whether there's some truth to them or whether they're completely false, and why we should, step forward with embracing the shroud a lot more and have more knowledge of it. So if you're okay with that, we can go through them.
Yeah, let's see where this goes.
Yeah. So I remember growing up from the secular side being told that the shroud had been debunked, that its authenticity has been completely debunked back in the 80s, that they did some carbon dating on it or something to that effect, and that it was actually traced back to the Middle Ages and not actually the first century. Mm-hmm. And is this still true, or what's modern scholarship on the shroud say now?
Right. Well, you phrased it just right. It's the international scholarly consensus that says the results from 1988 do not conclude that it's from 1260 to 1390 as they originally published. That's not Father Andrew's personal opinion. It's not the opinion of the Catholic Church. It's those who publish in the field, and it's a matter of a peer-reviewed scientific journal or article. So I'm thinking particularly out of Oxford, Archaeometry, the very publication that at first said, hey, this is medieval and it can't be traceable back to the person of Jesus Christ in the first century because it comes 12 or 1300 years after he walked the earth. Well, as it happens, now we have more information. What do we know? Here's the science experiment that you need to know about. Tristan Casabianca. He is a French researcher who sued it was the British Museum that had the charge to take a 8 centimeter slice of the shroud from the top left corner, and then it was redistributed. Little pieces were given to Tucson, Arizona, to Oxford, had its laboratory right there, and then also in Zurich. And they didn't tell you this in 88 and 89, but each individual laboratory got its own punctual date, and they're not the same. What did they do? They gave you an average, lumping them all together as if they were all one, but they didn't reveal that actually there's a gradient that moves in a linear line, that's in the linear function that moves as you go left to right across the cloth. It gets progressively younger. In the space of just 2 centimeters, it gets about 200 years younger.
Wow.
And since it's a linear function, you have to extrapolate and realize that if this continues, that by the time you get to the far right corner of a cloth that's 4.4 meters long, you'd have to imagine a date in the far-off future. And that's just not possible. So these are just some of the reasons that they came to conclude that that was an untenable result, mostly because it's not just that they were heterogeneous amongst themselves, Oxford, Arizona, Zurich, but they're not like the rest of the shroud, which is the whole thing you're aiming at. You're trying to date the shroud as a whole. And so what you typically would do is take samples from here, there, and everywhere, and then, get a sense of the whole garment. But instead, they took one sample from that top left corner, which we knew to be chemically anomalous. It's not like the rest of the shroud. It's not representative of the shroud of the whole. And they already knew that 10 years prior. If they had just looked at the brightness map, if you shine UV light and capture what fluoresces back, you can understand the chemical composition of the cloth. And it's all the same color, more or less these warm hues, except for that top left corner, which is forest green. And so they knew, or they ought to have known, that portion of the cloth is not representative of the cloth as a whole, and yet that's exactly where they drew the sample. And so accommodate as you like, provide the reason of your choice for why it resulted in that, And the result is the same. It's not representative of the cloth as a whole. Some people think that there are contaminants in that top left corner. Maybe there's some fungus. Maybe there's some result of a fire. Maybe there's some weave from the 16th century having repaired the cloth. Maybe it's because of the very event of the resurrection that skewed those results. Pick the theory of your choice. The result is the same. That test proves nothing about the date of the shroud as a whole. Again, not my opinion, but a scholarly international consensus on that point. So, if somebody tells you the shroud has been proven to be from the Middle Ages, you can know that they're not up to speed on the latest scholarship. That was published in 2019. Wow. The research came out in 2017 when Tristan Casabianca used a Freedom of Information Act to require the laboratories to reveal the raw data that they suppressed for some 3 decades. And the only reason it was revealed in the end was because they were compelled by law to do so.
So they already knew that portion that they pulled from the shroud itself was not like the rest of it.
They certainly ought to have known had they done their research, because that came out 10 years prior.
Wow.
But we have this on videotape. The moment they're about to snip away 8 centimeters of the most prized relic in the whole Christian world, and they're debating amongst themselves, where should we cut the sample? I said, do you think maybe you should have had that figured out, I don't know, like the day before? Like, this is ridiculous. You know, when they come to study the shroud in 78, they've prepared for a whole year so that all their tests would be non-destructive. They even made a stainless steel backing and then with magnets mounted it so that they didn't have to even with a pin kind of prick or damage in any way. And here we are about to carbon date. That is, carbonize means charring, burning it to a crisp and then counting the C14 and comparing it to the C12. You're going to ruin it and forever. And yet they don't know where they're going to take the sample. Wow. This is really irresponsible stuff. But it's chronicled, right? Check out the book by Joe Marino that tells the story in some 800 pages of all the ins and outs of it. But the bottom line will be the same, that it's simply not proved anything about the date of the shroud. We have other tests that do point towards the 1st century. It's true that it would be lovely if we also had a radiocarbon date that pinned it to the 1st century, if that's even possible. And some say, with the event of resurrection, maybe that's not even on the table as a viable way to date this particular cloth, given the unique circumstances which it finds itself in, namely that it contained a cadaver that became risen to glory. I don't know what that does to the chemical structure of anything, but I hope the bottom line is clear that people have often clung to that because it was convenient to do so, right? Because it was a way of dismissing all the rest. But here you have a plethora of evidence that points in the direction of authenticity. But you know what? I don't need to look because I have one smoking gun that says it's medieval, it's fake, so ignore the rest. That's not how a good detective does his work. You don't disregard all the rest of the evidence and just fideistically cling to the one piece that serves your own purposes.
Yeah. Well, not just disregard, but suppress some of the evidence and some of the most important evidence that you need in order to prove whether it's authentic or not. Exactly. So getting back to the historical record of it, I know of another argument that says that there's no solid evidence that this thing ever existed before the 1300s.
Right.
Is that true?
No, it's not. And in fact, just as one starting point, and there are many, but here's the one that I like to go to first because it's so definitive, is the Hungarian Prey Codex. And this is an illuminated manuscript that has a scene. It's one scene split into 2. First is the burial of Jesus, and you see the men with their beards bringing the body on top of a cloth onto a stone slab. It's obviously what we read about as Jesus is taken down from the cloth and laid in the tomb. But then scene 2, just below it, like a comic strip, it tells the story of the women who were going on Sunday morning, Easter Sunday, to anoint the body that isn't there, and the angel is pointing to say, "Why do you look for the living amongst the dead? He's not here, he's been raised." And he points his finger in the direction of the cloth. The cloth that was there in scene 1 is also seen in scene 2 and has multiple characteristics that proves it to be what is now called the Shroud of Turin, even though it didn't show up in Turin until the 1570s, and even in Europe until the 1350s. And so where was it prior to that? It was in, most likely, Asia Minor, Constantinople, right? And so the Hungarian Praecodex dates to 1192 to 1195. That is prior to the oldest date that the carbon dating said it has to hail from this time period. But no, as a matter of fact, it couldn't have. But that's just one touch point that is undeniable. We have there the hands of Jesus in that Praecodex show 4 fingers. Guess what? On the shroud, you don't see the thumbs. They're underneath the index finger. So they're in the exact same orientation, kind of folded across the pelvic region, but they're exactly as you see them on the shroud.
So it's like they were referencing it almost.
100%. And then beyond that, and this is, I think, undeniable, you see the herringbone weave. So on the loom, in order to achieve this particular type of weave, you would have to go over 3 threads, and then under 1, and then over 3, and that's why it's called a 3-to-1 herringbone. It kind of looks like the spinal cord of a fish, with these diagonal lines that go this way and then that. And it's the addition, it's so 4 fingers, plus herringbone, plus the poker holes. So we have, here I have a picture of the shroud in my hands right now, but can you see how these are burn marks that are responsible for these symmetrical triangle patterns? That's the result of a fire in 1532. But prior to that, there was what's called these poker holes. It's really a misnomer. Somebody was imagining a hot rod that was like poked through, but it's more likely that something like a charcoal that left its mark. But we have in the shape of a L or a 7, and it's twice because according to the folds, the lines of symmetry here.
Yeah.
That must have been prior to 1192 because it's painted, it's drawn on this manuscript I was telling you about in 1192.
They even get that detail. Wow.
So that means that there's no doubt that what that person was illuminating, what they were drawing, referenced the very same linen that today goes by the name Shroud of Turin, even though it hadn't arrived yet in Europe. So that's just one example, but then there's numismatics, right? There's study of coinage, there's iconography, the study of the mores, what's the word I'm looking for? The traditions that are enshrined so that you see Jesus with, I'm looking at one right now,
the icon,
right? The icon where you have Jesus with this big mop of hair. You have oftentimes a little curlicue, a little wisp of hair right at the front of the forehead, or big bulging eyes and disproportionately large or swollen cheeks, and a U between the eyebrows or a diagonal line across the throat. 13 to 15 characteristics that align with the shroud and these icons.
Wow.
Again and again and again. So the question is, why? Why didn't somebody get creative and dare to paint Jesus in a different way? And the answer is because they were looking to the shroud as a point of reference, as an authoritative prototype around which they had to base their portrayals. And they couldn't deviate because that's why this was referred to as the akera poieta, the not made with human hands. This was seen to be God's portrait of his own son. And so an artist can't exercise license and do something different when God has shown himself in a certain way. And that's most likely why you see in the 6th century in Mount Sinai's Pantokrator, but then again in Cefalu and again in here and there throughout the centuries, these same kind of motifs pop up again and again. Why? Because they're referencing an authoritative rendition of Jesus' face. Unlike, mind you, those renderings of his face in the first centuries prior to the knowledge of the shroud. So in Rome, for example, in the catacombs, do you know how Jesus was sometimes portrayed as an Apollo figure without a beard?
Yeah.
It was the way of showing a divinity, and now that is kind of christened, appropriated by the first Christians to explain who Jesus, Good Shepherd, is. Well, he's God. Well, what does God look like? Well, I don't have his picture yet, right?
Yet.
And so those early centuries didn't have that enshrined tradition yet. But once it came to be known, again and again, you didn't see 1,000 ways of portraying Christ in the icons. You had more or less one way. And that speaks to, I think, the shroud's authority.
Yeah. You look at today's artists and their own portrayals of Jesus, it always varies in some way. But it makes a lot of sense why icons and the face of Jesus all look very similar. There's something specific that when you look at an image of Jesus in an icon, there's a consistency there. So getting into the features of Jesus through paintings, but also I've heard the argument that the parts of the explanations of Jesus, and I want to specifically mention the hair.
Yeah.
The hair, I've heard through online chatter that is one thing that debunks it, because that's not something that maybe a Jewish man in the first century would be wearing, or the way, how in the style of then. What's the response to that?
Yeah, I don't think it's a solid argument. Certainly not a definitive one. It's I think it's like a tenuous argument. I think the argument that I've heard is a reference to, I think it's 1 Corinthians, where Paul says it's shameful for a man to have long hair.
Yeah.
And so it's, well, if it's shameful, what are we going to say, that Jesus had something shameful? Now, maybe others can answer this question better than I can, and I wouldn't be surprised. But I think that that's a bad argument, because for a couple of reasons. One, Paul is from a generation after. He wasn't walking with Jesus. He did see him in the resurrection, right, in that special appearance. But also, he wasn't in Jerusalem, but in Corinth. And that which is socially acceptable there doesn't necessarily translate to what's socially acceptable elsewhere. Just like when I go to Scotland and I don't wear a kilt, well, that's not my heritage. That's not my tradition, right? Yeah. But moreover, we read about in Jerusalem long-haired Jewish men going up to the temple with their Nazirite vow, right? I'm thinking of the ends of Acts of the Apostles. Mind you, that's after the resurrection by a generation or so. So it's certainly not impossible. And so if you're going to make your whole claim based on that, wow, that is as flimsy as it gets, it seems to me.
Sounds like an online argument to me. Yeah. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, moving on to another method of debunking that people talk about are, they get into the shroud itself and the color of the blood that's painted on there.
Yes.
They're saying it doesn't look like what blood would look like if it stains a piece of cloth, that it looks almost, maybe it's painted. It's a little too red.
A little too red,
yeah.
Exactly. So this is the last straw that convinced my Jewish friend and teacher, my mentor was Barry Schwartz, the Jewish photographer I think I mentioned earlier. He was initially skeptical of the shroud, and he assumed that they were going to show up and within minutes prove it to be iron oxide or some magnesium nitrate. They had made a list of every pigment known to man and in what age and in what space, so that they could pinpoint the method and the means by which this image was impressed upon the cloth. Was it a painting, a rubbing, a scorch? They were going to do those tests which were orchestrated to answer the question. And instead, they found no pigment, no ink, no paint, no brush strokes, no directionality with which color is applied to the cloth. Nothing soaks into the fibers. And is radically distinct, the body image, from the bloodstains. The bloodstains do soak into the medulla of the thread, and they're visible from the other side. If you backlight the shroud with transmitted light, you don't see the image of the body.
You see the blood.
Boy, do you see the blood stains, right? Because they're soaked into the fibers. And so the doctors, those who were immunologists and those who were experts on the blood stains, found serum albumin. They found different proteins that are in human blood. They were able to say, this is real human blood, and there's an excess of bilirubin. So this is exactly the effect of one who is beaten, that it flows into the bloodstream. You can even hear in the name the Latin root for the color red, right? It leaves red. It leaves the blood red because of this surfeit of bilirubin. And that endures as an effect even through time. And so when Barry Schwartz learned this from his immunologist friends, who are also Jewish, by the way. He said, I've got nothing left. I've got nothing to cling to fideistically assert the conclusion that this is fake, that this is the work of a con artist or something like that, because it's just on every front anatomically perfect. And this is seen in the blood. In fact, if you look at paintings of, you don't have to even be an expert, to be honest. Just look, pick the age you like, pick the 1900s, I think. Do we even paint blood stains convincingly like we see them on the shroud? We have clotting. We can differentiate venous blood that flows from the frontal vein from arterial blood that is closer to the artery here. We know there's post-mortem blood, the blood that comes from the spear wound between the fifth and sixth rib. That is not just blood, generally speaking. That is corpulous blood surrounded by a boundary of serous blood. In other words, it's blood that has separated. So once the heart stops beating, and now all those organelles can settle, red blood cells included, the red portions, which are denser, go down. But the serum, the plasma, rises to the top. And so that separation of blood occurs within 30 to 60 minutes after death. And now, as we read in the Gospels, they pierce his side, not while he's alive, but once he's already been dead. Well, how long was he dead? Evidently, at least 30 to 60 minutes, because what flows out is
water, blood.
Blood and water, he says, right in the Gospel. And so that's a way one might describe the outflow of post-mortem blood. It's that kind of blood that has left its stain, and nobody knew it until 1978.
Wow.
Because you can't see water with the naked eye.
Yeah.
But these STIRP scientists aren't looking with the naked eye. They've brought 80 crates of the most state-of-the-art equipment overseas so that they can discern more deeply what's going on. And what they discern is that there's a difference between the blood that flowed during his life, namely the blood that comes from his wrists, right? But the one that comes from his side, that's after he's already been dead. And so these are the kinds of arguments that I think point to the authenticity. Notice it's not one smoking gun, but it's the cumulative force of so many elements that are anatomically perfect, morphologically perfect, pathologically perfect. That is what really makes a convincing case. Let me add one element to that, which is so similar. If you were a painter, which would you do first? Would you paint the body and then add the bloodstains? Or would you go in the other order? Would you start with random bloodstains here, there, and everywhere, and then have to reconstruct a body around that?
Of course, you build a body first.
Of course, which would mean that underneath the bloodstains, the red marks that you added on, you would see evidences of what you painted first. That is not the case on the shroud.
Wow.
So think of this. Jesus is buried, and his blood-stained body is immediately in contact with the cloth. That's what leaves its impression first. Those linen strips, those fibers that are in contact with blood are coated. They're saturated through and through. They're not available to receive the impression of the body, which comes in a second moment. When? I think the best evidence points to the moment of resurrection, which means we're not talking about a death cloth.
Yeah.
We're talking about a resurrection cloth, because the trace of the body is most likely, given all the evidences, the result of the resurrection itself. And those fibers that are already saturated with blood are not available to receive the image that comes in the light of the resurrection.
Wow. Okay. So you partially answered my next question, because so the light is what imprinted the image on the shroud itself.
That's where the evidence seems to be. If you were to map out all of the theories that have ever been proposed and kind of made columns and said, okay, does this theory map onto this particular characteristic and this one and this one? The least bad naturalistic proposal is that some sort of radiant energy is responsible for the impression that we see. Why? Because it's superficial. It only penetrates 0.2 microns. That's 1/5 of a thousandth of a millimeter. Okay, so that's less than half of the width of a human hair. We don't have a micro laser that has been able to reproduce the shroud image as we see it in the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah.
okay, so if this is the case, the shroud is the most studied archaeological object in the history of the world, and we're not closer to reproducing what we actually see.
Keep getting further away from it.
We're actually, it's more enigmatic. It's more mysterious because the more we know, the more unique this cloth is shown to be. And so that, I think, points to, well, what I was going to say next. The physicist that studied linen, and I mean, he went all the way down. He used pollen grains from the time period of Jesus that they were able to grow and produce flax from which they derived linen that then they put in the exact same weave, this herringbone that I was describing earlier, and then he spent 5 years playing with the variables of light with lasers, trying to leave a caramel color on a cloth if only he had the right variables of frequency, amplitude, duration of exposure. After 5 years, is able to calculate the amount of radiant energy. And this is what he concludes: 34,000 billion watts, 34 trillion joules per second. So it's not just a big burst of power, but it's power over time. In other words, 1/40 billionth of a second is what seems to be this impulse that leaves a cold, quick, radiant energy that leaves its trace. That's from a sheerly scientific study.
Wouldn't that have charred it if it was a natural thing?
This is the frustration, is that's why it took 5 years, because he was initially either charring it or getting no effect whatsoever. But if you get it in the sweet spot, you can leave a kind of sepia tone. Granted, at the microscopic level, it's not exactly the same, but it allows you at least to postulate the amount of energy required to leave a trace. And this is what's significant, because look, I don't know of another cadaver that emanates light of any kind, much less 34,000 billion watts of it.
And how do you replicate that in a natural world, especially in the if it was created in the Middle Ages? How do you get that much power?
How do we do it today?
There you go.
This is no one has.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that there was a $1 million reward. Check out David Rolfe.
$8 million?
Yeah. No,
Wow.
1 million.
1 million,
Yeah.
okay.
So
Still.
first it came in London and then in the United States. But no one's been able to reproduce all of the characteristics. And this, you be careful. When you hear arguments against the shroud, usually what they do is they latch on to one element and say, aha, I can explain 1 out of 100 things. Therefore, it's
all
debunked.
debunked.
That's so silly. That is so irresponsible. And yet it kind of works for those who don't have anything in their arsenal.
Yeah.
Right? And this is what we saw most recently. What is that? Just last summer that someone says, it must be a bas relief. It must be like a statue that was heated up. No, we already debunked that decades ago. And yet it's rehashed and it makes a splash on the internet. And a lot of us are defenseless against it.
Wow. That leaves me speechless. I just you never think about the millions of factors that would be needed in order to try to recreate that, which we still have not achieved to this day. So,
can I go somewhere with this?
Please
because
do.
It seems to me that we need to start with a kind of what's our approach generally? Like, what should be our methodology here? And sadly, what I've seen is there's been a kind of fixation on the authenticity question and the arguments that would debunk. And sometimes we miss an alternative approach. And so let me propose this for a second, because it seems to me that, look, we've not proved that the shroud is from the 1st century. We've not proved from a scientific or historical point of view that it is pertaining to the person of Jesus. I think we have a super abundant a plethora of evidences that do point towards that conclusion, but I'll have to be honest, it's not apodictic. It's not inevitable. It's not impossible. We can't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? I think we have ample evidences, but park that for a second. Just bracket the question for a moment and just consider what we do have. This is the approach that I want to say. If you're Sherlock Holmes and you come to the crime scene, what you should do is gather evidence A, evidence B, evidence C. Just gather what you know. Gather what everybody knows. and then build your argument on what I like to call minimal facts, right? Because everyone can readily recognize that the shroud bears an image that is anatomically perfect, morphologically and pathologically. That is to say, the shape and the sufferings are described with such anatomical perfection that we can't imagine that that's a painting from the Middle Ages. But that's just one. Next, it's a photonegative, or something like a photonegative, because in 1898, Secondo Pia snaps a photo and discerns for the first time that the negative is no negative at all. It's the negative that is the positive image. And so that suggests that the shroud itself, the original linen, is something like a photo document. But that's impossible, right? Because that's 18 centuries before the invention of photography. So explain that. That's a minimal fact. We don't have any other grave clothes that bear an image of a man with anatomical perfection and as a photo negative. That's just two.
Yeah.
Let's keep going. In 1976, Eric Jumper and John Jackson slip an image of the man of the shroud's face under the VP8 image analyzer and realize that this two-dimensional cloth, flat as a tablecloth, encodes 3D information. So we can reconstruct the body like a sculpture and know the contours, his posture, the way his head, obviously his head was bowing in the vertical position, his knees were bent when on the cross. Well, in the supine position, when he's lying flat, even on that slab of stone, his head seems raised. Is there a pillow below his head? No. He's in rigor mortis. Is there some triangular support under his knees? No. His body is stiff because that's the result, especially where there's a high concentration of blood and where there's been a lot of physical exertion. That rigor mortis is severe. And so he maintains this position, so much so that we see his hands now forced down. Remember, they were spread wide on the cross, but to carry him from the site of crucifixion, some 140 feet to the site of burial, they would have forced the arms down. But now he's locked in that new position. The buttocks being curved is proof of this, right? The tip of the fingers, for example, when pressed to a flat surface like this table, will be pressed flat. That's what you would have expected. That's not what you see. In Jesus, the curvature is evidence of rigor mortis. Wow. These are some of those subtle details, but it's not just that. Though he's in that position, and though the blood is transferred from his body into the cloth, pasting the linen to his body, we know there's a separation. At some point, he was wrapped, now he's not, now he's exited. And yet where's the sign of wrenching off the Band-Aid? Where's the smearing, the smudging? Not a millimeter. It's as if, like light through a window pane, in the moment of resurrection, he just exits out of his cloth container. Wow. Here's where I want to make a spiritual reflection. Even though I'm trying to talk about minimal facts, I just can't help the typological relationship that we see. Do you know baby Jesus wrapped in what? Swaddling clothes, remember that? And laid in a manger. So the fathers of the church have often put side by side baby Jesus and Jesus reborn to glory. There's a kind of rhyme. In fact, he was in a virgin womb. Well, later he'll be in a virgin tomb. Do you know that I'm sure your listeners would know that Mary was perpetually virgin, not just before and after, but during birth. She was virgin. What does that mean? She was integral. She was she was unbroken. Like light through a window pane, miraculously, Jesus moves from his inside container to his outside space. How does he do that? Well, not in the natural way, but in a supernatural way. It seems to me that this is what we have evidence of. As Jesus, in the glory of the resurrection, that glory which was prefigured in the transfiguration, when his face shone like the sun, his body becomes luminous, and remember, it leaves its trace where? On the clothes that he's wearing. His clothes become white as light. Well, that was the transfiguration, not the resurrection. Right, but the transfiguration is a preamble. It's an adumbration, a foretaste of resurrected glory.
Wow.
So it makes sense that he who called himself the light of the world, in the moment of new Genesis, new creation, the moment of the resurrection, it's a luminous effect. And that trace is seen, I believe, not just in his body, but on the cloth that touched his body. And so what you end up understanding is that which the physicist can measure, joules per second, 34,000 watts, actually comports with a theological message which says, here comes the dawn of a new day. It's an eschatological era that Jesus is ushering in, and he's the first fruits. We're the full harvest. We await the glory that we see in him consummated, but in us, it's barely inaugurated.
Wow.
And so we know where we're going. Our destiny is the way he went, provided we cling to him, provided we're in communion with him. Wow. Like the clothes that are in communion with him, with his head, right? And so I'm sure I could go on, but I was trying to say, look, rapid succession, anatomical perfection, photographic negative, 3D information, sits on the surface of the fibers, the most studied archaeological object, and yet we can't reproduce it or even explain a method by which it might be produced.
Wow.
Isn't it much more likely that those minimal facts are best explained by the simple message we've always been told, that Jesus rose bodily in the flesh? That, I think, helps us come to the conclusion that this cloth actually does hail from the first century, because it's best explained by the miracle that we know from other independent historical resources of an event like that. You would need something like a resurrection. Look, I don't know if there was somebody resurrected in the 12 or 1300s, but somebody tell me if there's, in the annals of history, any other candidate that is even up for discussion. There isn't.
Wow. So you mentioned typology, and I want to kind of get into the scripture of it.
Yeah.
Are there details in scripture that help support, or that we see details in scripture that translate to details on the shroud itself of Jesus and his death and resurrection?
Oh my gosh.
Where do we get started?
Yeah, exactly. Can you sign up for a postgraduate certificate in chastity? Because I teach a course that lasts a semester, and we trace from the Last Supper through the agony, and then all of the mysteries. Think in terms of the rosary, after you have Caiaphas and Pontius Pilate, the scourging, the crowning, the Via Crucis, the crucifixion itself, the burial, the resurrection. At each of those, you could ask the question, what do we know from the shroud?
Yeah.
And then you shouldn't stop there. You should say, what does Scripture have to say about each of those individual elements?
Yeah.
As Catholics, we have some help and some tradition in that, because in praying the rosary, we do kind of pause at what is just half a breath in the Bible, right? And having him scourged, Pontius Pilate had him, led off to be crucified. You're like, pause, tell me about that.
There's
like,
more. Give
there's
me more.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. So Isaiah says, by his stripes we were healed. I mean, we could go deeply, and I do in the class, but we don't have time for it. Can I pick the one that I think is most interesting?
Please do.
The crown. Because when I was a kid, I didn't know what to think when I saw the crown. But now I can't unsee what I've learned from Scripture. Because look, from the shroud, you can learn that it's a helmet. It covered the whole of his head, not just a band or a circlet that left the top of the head exposed. Mm-hmm. We know that the puncture wounds are most likely evidence of thorns that are 3/4 of an inch long. Maybe the Ziziphus spina Christi is the species of plant. All of that, interesting as it may be, is rather superficial information. It's not the larger, deeper question of why. What is it? Why is it significant theologically that Jesus be crowned, and crowned with thorns? And this is as profound as the ocean, it seems to me, because in Genesis, there are no thorns described in the original garden. Yeah. There are the trees that have fruit that are good to eat in Genesis 1 and 2. But immediately after they eat of the forbidden fruit,
the fall is when you hear about it.
This is where we hear it. Wasn't it Genesis 3:18 and following? The Lord God shows up to Adam and says, "Because you have listened to your wife and eaten of the fruit of which I said, thou shalt not eat of it. Cursed be the ground because of you." So there is a cosmic curse over all the earth, and He tells you what shape it takes as He goes on to say, Thorns and thistles shall it bear forth, and only by the sweat of your brow shall you have bread to eat. This seems deeply significant to me. This is the consequence of the original sin. And he's telling you that disorder, chaos, sin is now symbolized as thorn and thistle. And that motif is going to be repeated throughout the Old Testament in the Psalms and various books of the Old Testament. But I love this. It gets picked up by Jesus. That same language, thorns and thistles, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, we find Jesus say, beware of false prophets. They are like ravenous wolves in sheep's clothing. But don't worry, guys. You'll know them by their fruit. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? Do you see how Jesus used the exact same language, showing that, go figure, he knew his Bible, and he knew that thorns and thistles were a symbol of sin and the effects of sin. And so put two and two together, and what do you get? You get that Jesus, without using words, but simply by being crowned with thorns, is saying, I am the sin bearer. I bear the sins of the world on my own head.
Wow, that's powerful.
And there's so much more. That's just to the tip of the iceberg. Do you remember there's a feast day for the Jews of Yom Kippur, the day of covering, the day of atonement? How do you cover or atone for sins? Once you've been alienated, how can you be at one? How can you atone? Well, they would tell you the priest had to lay his hands on the head of a vicarious victim, namely the scapegoat. But in this way, we would liturgically symbolize the transfer of the sins of the community onto one who would die and be cast out into the wilderness far, far away. That's how we rid ourselves of this infection that has plagued us. Okay, so Jesus, as it happens, on his head gets crowned with thorns, as if to say, the sins of others placed upon me. Upon him, the chastisement that makes us whole. By his stripes, we were healed. Jesus is paying a debt he doesn't owe because we owe a debt that we can't pay. Jesus is taking that upon himself. The most important typological reference I can think of is Genesis 22.
Are you bringing up Isaac and Abraham?
Exactly.
And the ram caught in the...
Yes.
Oh,
so
wow.
where the ram? So let's rehearse that story real quick.
Please.
So it's Abraham. First of all, his name used to be Avram, right? Exalted father. God says, no, that won't do. You need to be
Father of many.
Father of a multitude, Avraham. And so it's laughable. He's got one kid.
And he's old.
And so he's pushing 100.
Yeah.
His kid is in his 30s, according to the rabbinical literature. That's their tradition. Isn't that interesting?
That is very interesting.
How do you bind a 30-year-old boy? He's not 4 or 6 years old.
A 100-year-old man binding a 30-year-old.
Exactly. And if you remember the story, the only beloved son is going up the mountain of sacrifice on the third day, and he's saying, hey, Dad, here's the wood for the sacrifice.
Carrying the wood up.
Where's the lamb? That's not a little kid. And so, yes, that rhymes with Jesus, insofar as Jesus is the only beloved son. But it gets better than that. It's deeper than that, because at the moment he's bound, suggestive perhaps that he was a willing victim, much like Jesus was a willing victim, saying amen to the will of his Father once his Father, explained what his will was. Be that as it may, what we know is this: the angel stays the hand of Abraham and says, now that I know that you fear God, that you truly believe, do no harm to this boy. And when he spins around, he sees, as you said, the ram, not a lamb. A lamb is promised, but a lamb is not given, not on that day. It's a ram with its horns wrapped in a thicket. So this is more specific. It's, yes, his head is wrapped in thorn, and yes, he will be the vicarious victim that dies instead.
Yeah.
But it's the horns that are wrapped. This is where you need to know a little Hebrew, because the word horn is the same word for power or might, which makes total sense, right? Because how do you show your muscle? How do you fight or defend yourself when being fought?
Yeah.
Charge, right?
Yeah.
Head, muscle against muscle, might against might. Do you remember how Jesus, at the foot of the cross, is hearing words like these? You saved others, save yourself.
By your own power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like saying, you showed power? Well, Jesus, if you've got that kind of power, flex. Jesus is saying, you want to see power? I'll show you power. I will die, and on the third day rise. But for the time being, my horns are wrapped in a thicket. That is to say, I won't use it. I've got it, but I decide to keep my hands pinned behind my back. Go ahead, give me your best shot, is what he's saying. Wow. He's almost like taunting his enemies. You think you got power? All right, guys, convene, converge. Spend all your strength on me. I won't dodge the bullet. I'm going to take the blow, and it will deliver me unto death. I'll descend into Hades.
Whoa.
I'll go all the way down. But then, like light that shines out of the darkness, Jesus is back. And what is he saying in so many words? That's it? Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. He's not on the same footing as the devil.
Yeah.
How does he show it? By saying, guys, get together. Show me all your strength.
Yeah.
Let's see how it compares to mine. And it's ineffable. It's incommensurable. It's infinitely more what the God-man displays in his resurrection than the sum of all inimical powers from the dawn of time to the end of age. This is what is represented, Jesus' victory as he's risen. And so, who is this King of Kings crowned in thorns? He's a paradoxical Lord, to use the words of Benedict. What's paradoxical is that they're mocking his kingship in the very moment he's manifesting divine love, a new paradigm of what it means to be king. Gentile kings lord it over their subjects. Yeah. Not me. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, and this is divine love, divine power on display. Wow. That's what we see in the crown, and it is glorious, but it's mysterious, and it needs contemplation. That's why if all you've got is a microscope, all you've got is your science book, you're not going deep enough.
Wow. That we could end it there, but I have one more thing that I want to talk about that causes a lot of confusion among people, and it's the wounds on not the hands but the wrists. That a lot of people get confused by that and get a little tripped up.
Yes.
What do we make of that?
Oh, this is a great one, because what seems to be a counter argument, by the time you learn what's actually there, it becomes the most positive argument in favor of the shroud. Watch this. So as it happened, yes, you're right, that the exit wound is what you see on the shroud. Where the nail goes in is of course on the palm side of things. It's right here. If you want to find the spot, just put the pinky and the thumb together, bend all the way down. And then under the thenar furrow, there's this little divot right in here. It seems to enter into desto space or Z space in the metacarpals, okay? It exits out these little bundle of bones about 1.5 centimeters higher, so closer to the shoulder on the opposite side. That's the exit wound you see on the shroud. That is...
Can you show us one more time just for the camera?
Yeah, so it seems to go in right in here. That is what we have to speculate about, because we see where it exits out on the opposite side. Somewhere
because the hands are down, so we only see the back end of it. Yeah.
Exactly. So you have to imagine what it would have been when his hands were unfurled like this. Okay, so isn't that an argument against? Because in the Gospels it says he was crucified in his hands and his feet, right? Thomas, come and see my hand. Cheiros. Well, the forearm ends at the end of the ulnar and the radius. But the hand is phalanges, carpals, and metacarpals. So that is absolutely, anatomically speaking, the hand.
Yeah.
The wrist is part of the hand. That on the one hand. No pun intended. Okay, next. But it's not possible that the nails be in the center of the palms, because that wouldn't sustain half the weight of a human body if you put him on display. This we know because a French surgeon did the experiment. This is a bit morbid perhaps, but it's actually super helpful. If you put there's no transversal support here. This is all soft tissue in the center of the palm. And so there's no way. Do you know the first century literature tells of days in which the victim could be hanging? There's no way you could sustain that kind of weight. It's not even 10 minutes. With just a little shove, it would tear right through.
That's wait for hours, and since he said 10 minutes is all it would take in order to
all it takes with a little shove, you'd be breaking through already. And so the shroud, although it deviates from our own tradition, and so it's the exact opposite of what a con artist would be likely to describe. Think of it. I'm trying to convince you that my artwork pertains to the real historical Jesus. don't I paint it the way you're expecting it?
Why not put it in the hand instead of the wrist?
Right.
Yeah.
And yet the shroud is just recording the raw data, and it doesn't care if that aligns with my expectations or not.
Wow.
But as it happens, what it actually portrays is more in sync, scientifically speaking, because this could sustain his weight, whereas our tradition couldn't. So you know what we should get rid of? What our imaginations and stick with the evidences. Okay, that on the one hand, but what about the stigmatists? The stigmatists are people like Padre Pio and St. Rita and many others have had. St. Paul,
Yep.
I bear the stigmata, the wounds of Christ, the marks of Christ
Yeah.
in his body, right? This was a justification for his ministry, of course. But he says the essential thing. They're not just marks of Christ. When you see Padre Pio celebrating Mass and bleeding from his hands, what do you think? Oh, the wounds of Christ
Yeah.
are the wounds of Pio. And so it is that we can, like Paul, say, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. We participate mysteriously by grace in the very passion of Jesus. That's the theological truth. And so the stigmatists themselves, thanks be to God, offer the explanation to say, don't think that these wounds in the center of my palms correspond to an anatomical lesson about how Jesus was crucified. That's not the point. God condescends to speak a language that we can understand, even if it's not precise with regard to the anatomy of things. In the same way that Mary, Our Lady of Guadalupe, appears in Mexico, are we to assume that she's Mexican because she appears with that kind of visage in the 1500s, right? No, I think we all understand that Mary is our mother. And so it's appropriate that she appear in one way, in one time period and in one place. And we understand that there's a kind of spiritual truth to that.
Yeah.
So too, I think it's understandable why Padre Pio and these mystics had their wounds in the center of the palms, and that doesn't correspond to what we see on the shroud, because this is anatomically accurate. Theirs is the theological truth that they're capturing. And they themselves understood their wounds in that way. So I think we should trust them.
Wow. Well, I would love to go on for another hour because it's just fascinating, but I know we have to conclude it there. Father, if there's if people want to dig deeper into the shroud, where do they go to find accurate information?
Yeah, I would send them to othonia.com, othonia.org. This is our website where you can learn more through coursework or go to a nearby museum. There are museums all over the world. There are booklets that you can order. There are podcasts and videos that you can watch. You can scan, do a deep dive. You can even interrogate an AI that doesn't go all into the internet, but it goes into the kind of best curated information about the shroud. That's Othonia. That's the Greek word for the linen cloths that we read about in John 20. Othonia is Othonia.
Beautiful. Father Andrew Dalton, thank you